The Asian Economic Crisis, the crisis which launched 1,000 books. One of those books is Asian Eclipse, exposing the dark side of business in Asia. Its writer, 32-year-old Australian Michael Backman. Michael Backman has traveled through, lived and worked in parts of Asia, and now he calls himself an authority on Asian business. He loves Asian culture, but he deplores Asian corporate practices. In the book, Mr. Backman gives a bleak account of corporate Asia. Chapter after chapter, he charges its governments and big business with crimes which caused the regional economic crisis, censuring the Asian way and Asian values.
Welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you very much.
Let me start off by asking you, what's your definition of Asian values?
Asian values is a very broad concept, and I think it means many different things to many different people. But to me, I guess you'd have to say it has a lot to do with Confucianism and the liking of having sort of like a patriarchal figure and so on. And so I think, but it's very hard to define, I think.
Now, are you confusing that with Confucian ethics?
No, well, no, because I think the two are quite linked, actually. And whether you're Chinese or you're not, or whether you're Malay or whether you're, say, Indonesian, Javanese or whatever, I think there are many aspects of those societies which are quite Confucian. And so whether or not it's a direct link to Confucianism, it's as if they're kind of Confucian. You know, we have the need for the patriarchal figure, whether it's in a factory or in a country, you know, with a political leader or so on. It's something which is emulated in many parts of Asia. And certainly the sense of community, or sometimes it's not really community, but communalism perhaps might be more accurate. And the sense or the sense of the family. This is very common across a lot of Asia.
Now, as an Asian reading your book,
Yes.
it was a little strange to find that in the first paragraph of your chapter 1, and I quote, "What could the Singapore Chinese bond trading yuppies with Budweisers in one hand and mobile phones in the other have in common with the Dani tribesmen of Indonesia's Irian Jaya province?" And then you went on in the next paragraph to say that Asia is dominated by Confucian thinking, which many, especially in the non-Chinese societies, would probably disagree with. Now, it seems that between those two paragraphs, you have jumped a few steps over the cultural diversities in Asia. Now, why is that?
I guess that initially I'm posing the question from an outsider. When you look at the Dani tribesmen and the people down at, say, Harry's Bar in Singapore, ostensibly there are a lot of differences. And of course, if you look at a lot of the people, say, down at Boat Quay or whatever on a Friday night, they are very westernised. You know, they have all of the accoutrements of the West, the mobile phone and so on, and they're very, busy playing the markets and so on. But if you look at, the societies across the region more broadly, and you look at, the average opinions in Singapore and Malaysia and Indonesia and so on, there still are a lot of commonalities. There are some very broad themes. And so really it's the broad themes that I'm looking at. But, I would counsel against people reading too much into it as well. You've got to look at the broad things. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule, such as, some of the more westernised, or maybe not westernised, but modernised, perhaps Singaporeans or Malaysians or whatever. So you always have these outliers, but if you look at the average position of people right across Asia, there are some commonalities.
Now, one of the strongest criticisms of your book came from the Australian, and I think it was the foreign editor who said that the cultural generalizations you've made in your book have damaged your credibility. He cited your first chapter on Asian values as being the silliest and full of the grossest generalizations, backed by all those anecdotes.
Yes.
Now, how do you respond to that?
Oh, look, he is perfectly entitled to his opinion. He is one person, one commentator, and perhaps some of these ideas of his, perhaps, and criticisms say more about him than they do of me. I totally stand by what I've done. I think I'm completely correct in what I've written. I stand by.
You don't think it was too much of a generalization?
Oh, no, I don't. No. I mean, I've lived in Southeast Asia and spent a lot of time here, spent a lot of time with Southeast Asians and looking at you know, what operates here and
Just
so
for the
on.
record, how long have you been in Southeast Asia?
Well, I've been travelling here on and off since, I guess, late 1980s. Lived for several years in Jakarta. I come here many times a year, not just to Southeast Asia, but to Hong Kong and perhaps China and elsewhere.
When you first set out to write Asian Eclipse, what were some of the difficulties you had in forming your arguments?
Okay, really, there weren't too many difficulties because I had thought for many years about the book. And I must say, you know, the book was certainly not a response to the Asian crisis because I did start to write it before that. And from my observations of having travelled here so many times and having lived in the region and so on, I felt there was quite an inconsistency between the legal structures and the institutions to protect the investment that was coming in. And then when you looked at that and you looked at the investment that was coming in, it didn't seem to make a lot of sense. So I felt that perhaps something was really needed to balance the score, to explain to people and to explain to people perhaps in the West about some of the dangers and so on. And of course, when I was writing the book, which I did for the Australian government back in 1995, there were many ideas and things then which I wanted to put in the book, but they were either not relevant or not appropriate. So from that time, I'd thought about a lot of these things and they were, I guess, formulating in my mind. And I really wanted to basically to like download it, and that's what I did. So when I actually wrote the book, it didn't take that long because I'd been thinking about all these things for many years.
Would you say that your book gives the definitive picture of doing business in Asia?
Well, as the author of it, absolutely.
Now, why would a businessman want to go out and get a copy of your book?
I think because for many years outside of Asia, there was a real sort of a thing about, get into Asia, it's growing, you can make a lot of money and so on. But, the truth really was that you could lose a lot of money as well. And when I say that, I'm talking about, the countries outside of, say, those countries which have really good legal jurisdictions, such as Singapore and Hong Kong. And so what I wanted to do was to better inform people. Because I often say with the regional media or the local media, say whether it's Thailand or Jakarta or China, often the business media is very poor at explaining what's happening and so on. Journalists are bribed, for example. They're not paid much money, so that makes them very susceptible to accept money, not to report things on local companies and whatever. And often the media is compromised because you have a newspaper, whether it's in Jakarta or something like that, and the newspaper is owned by someone who also happens to own a bank or a cement plant or a noodle factory, this, that and everything else. And of course in that situation the media is hardly going to be independent and report fairly. And so I felt that it was absolutely crucial to have a book like this to explain to people about some of the dangers. It was only fair. And I know in Australia, the Australian government, particularly under the former Prime Minister Keating, he was always saying, to Australian business, go to Asia, you can make a lot of money. But they never basically told you that you could also lose a lot, and that doing business, say, in Indonesia or Thailand is nothing like doing business in Australia or Singapore. Entirely different.
But you've got to admit that this is not peculiar to Asia alone. I mean, it happens in Latin America, it happens in Russia.
Oh, look, it happens yes, of course. I mean, it happens in southern Italy is another example, of course. But, I mean, I didn't want to write a book on the world. I had to narrow it down. And given that my interest is Asia and that I live in the region, Asia is the natural thing to write. The other thing that I'd like to say is that, I mean, very clearly corporate Asia has big problems. I mean, you don't have an economic crisis of the magnitude that Asia has had for no reason. So there are very, very big problems in Asia, right across Asia. Less so, of course, in a country like Singapore or Hong Kong, but in other places, it's disastrous. And if you have a big problem, in order to fix a problem, you must first define the problem. Okay, you can't come up with a solution when you don't really know what the problem is. So what I've sought to do in Asian Eclipse is to define the problem. So the book is as much for people who live in Asia as much as outsiders. I mean, if you have some leaders in the region saying, oh, the crisis was caused by speculators, not by us, not by our legal system. We had Suharto in Indonesia sort of saying, oh no, the crisis was caused by El Nino. I mean, I can tell you that bad weather did not cause the Asian economic crisis. I mean, it was caused by the business structures, the corporate governance, the corruption, the cronyism, things like that. So the book is as much for people who live in Asia as it is for outside, people who live outside Asia.